And welcome to the contemplative path through the crisis. I hope the crisis hasn't been treating you too badly. I know you were just telling me you've been working even harder during these days of confinement. It's been a pleasure to talk with you over the years about your work and your research into meditation and children. And it will be really interesting and helpful, important, I think, for our listeners, our community, to hear how you came into this and what this research means in your view, how you interpret it, and how you feel that it is something really urgent for today as well. So you've studied and researched on this topic very deeply and very thoroughly. So thank you for sharing this time with us and for sharing your wisdom on it. Could you just give us a little introduction to yourself, where you are and how you got there?
Sure. Okay. So I live in Australia. I live in, one of the most beautiful parts of the country on the north coast of New South Wales. So a beautiful place to ponder things where I live. I work in a university. I've been an academic for about 25 years, and a good bit of that time has been spent in research, in undertaking research. My background is actually as a teacher, Laurence. I trained as a primary school teacher many years ago, and I'm often asked about, where's the path? How come the path has brought you, to where you are? And I said, I just think I've always had a deep love and respect and regard and humility, really, in terms of children and children's lives and what they have to teach us and what we have to learn from them. So I work as a professor of childhood studies at our university, not so far from here. I head up a centre called, no surprises, Centre for Children and Young People. So not the centre on children and young people, and not the centre on there's Centre for Children and Young People, because we've got a fairly unashamed emphasis in the work that we do, in making sure, or in the research that we do, in making sure there's a so what. So our research is singularly focused on understanding the well-being of children and young people. We've got a particular interest in children's human rights, in their humanity, in their dignity, and in their rights, and what that might mean for what we provide children, for how we protect children, but especially for opportunities for children to more actively participate in the matters that they care about, the issues that impact on their lives. So most of my research, including the research that I've done around Christian meditation, has had a very strong emphasis on hearing directly the views and perspectives of children and young people. And I love that work. I'm well supported in that work, by my family and my colleagues. But it's a real privilege, I think, to be, for me anyway, it's a real privilege to even have the chance to reflect on how much I've learned by working with children and young people over the years.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne, very much. So it has always struck me that you don't approach this just as a kind of cold observer from the outside, treating the children as objects under a microscope, but that you really do listen to them, give them a chance to express their voice, express their experience, and seek their views. Why is that so important? Because people might say, well, they don't have much experience, it's up to the adults to make decisions for them and look after them. And of course, that's obviously true up to a point. But how do you balance this sensitive respect for children. And of course, I think our idea of children has changed so much over the centuries, in this century or in the last 50 years, immensely. We've become aware of how what happens to a child in childhood can devastate or enrich their lives permanently. So we've got different opinions about what a child is, although maybe still conflicting with old opinions. But how do you draw that balance between respecting the child and the rights and the wisdom of a child, along with our need to teach, instruct, and protect them?
Comes back to some fundamental assumptions about who is the child. I think for many years we thought about children as sort of human becomings that we needed to work with or work on, or human belongings. So they're in that sense, not as people in their own right, not necessarily as human beings, as not always in the forefront of our mind. And so one of the things that I think, we've worked for the last 25 years in childhood studies, which has really been trying to come to terms with the fact that children do have agency. Yes, they're vulnerable. Yes, they're not. Yes, their capacities are still evolving, is the way that we think about it. But that they do have views, and they do have experiences. And as adults, we're very often not privy to what they are. So for a long time, I think it's exactly as you said, Laurence. We mightn't have said it, but we thought, well, what do children really have legitimate views? What could they offer that we could rely upon? Could we rely upon their accounts? Could we, in the context of research, so you've got to be careful in my space because, I'm a social scientist, but there's a rigour around all of that. So working with children in the context of research, I think, was a major gap. We would do research on them, we would do research about them, but we really pulled up short of doing research with them. And that was particularly so if what we wanted to find out or what we wanted to solve through research or address through research happened to be around a kind of a sensitive issue, that we really can't ask kids about these things because that might put them at risk. So what we've really developed, I think, over the years is a far more respectful understanding of children as human beings, of their capacities, of their agency, of their voice, and of what they can tell us. And I think the biggest learning that I've had, and in fact we've done research that's been able to really address this directly, is children do best when they're working collaboratively with adults. They don't expect adults to give up all of their authority. They just expect them to kind of share their power. So when it comes to ways that we approach the research, particularly when sometimes it's around issues children haven't even put words on. And so we need to develop really refined, tailored, safe, respectful methods of being able to work with children from a whole range of backgrounds. I work with a lot of children who've got cognitive disability, for example, so words don't come as easily, so we have to find other ways of being able to hear their views. But my continued, I think, efforts are at looking at ethical ways that we can undertake research with children, because we see them first and foremost as human beings, not as objects of our concern.
Have you come to a perspective on the wisdom of children? Are they a source of wisdom for you?
I cannot think of a project. I have done, I don't know, countless research projects, some of them very large scale projects that have involved, up to 10,000 young people. And Laurence, I can say with my hand on my heart, I don't think that I've ever been engaged in this research where I haven't been surprised or moved, sometimes quite deeply, by what it is that children have to tell us. As I said earlier, I think the learning that we do when we are present, and in the kind of research that I need to do, we need to create a space where we can be really present as kids, often think out loud, sometimes for the first time about some of these issues, but wisdom and emotional intelligence about what they feel comfortable to share and not to share about their experiences is quite extraordinary. I've often wondered why we haven't developed, I'm a sociologist by background, and I've often wondered why, as a sociologist, because I work across different disciplines, I work a lot in psychology, as particularly with social psychologists. So I'm really interested in the ways in which, the social processes shape children's lives. But I've often wondered why we've never developed a theology of childhood as such. And part of my reason for saying that is because the meaning making of children is quite extraordinary. When we're asking the right questions or providing the right context for that conversation to occur, I think that's something that's really, kind of calls us to think a little bit more about that. Yeah.
Thank you. What do you think? I was going to ask this question. Do you think that childhood is that stage of human development that is symbolized by the Garden of Eden? And we know that there's at least one serpent in the Garden of Eden, so it's not a perfectly happy place, but it is a place of a particular kind of consciousness and so on. And then we have to leave that Garden of Eden, and there's no going back into it. So, but I was going to ask, and that's, that has been true from the dawn of the human species. Would you agree with that? That Genesis story is about childhood and leaving childhood?
Yes and no. I think
a good researcher's answer.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, it may be one way of thinking about childhood. One of the things that I think limits us in being able to engage and to listen well with children is that we generalise and universalise children's experiences. So I think we do sometimes carry images of what childhood is or should be. And that may be true in terms of what they might experience and leave behind. But it may not. And part of my work with adults working with children, with teachers, with social workers and with others is to really challenge some of those assumptions. What is their image of what the ideal childhood is or should be? The extent to which, it's interesting you raise it, thinking about that in terms of the Garden of Eden. So I've always kind of challenged that because I don't think we can really meet the child. We can't really know the child. We can't understand the child, listen well to the child, be present to the child, unless we can leave behind some of those assumptions. What I think has been the experience for some 10-year-olds is not the experience for others, or if they did have a Garden of Eden experience, it might have been a very short one. So
yes, I think that's, which brings me to the next question, which is, some people would say that childhood is, in one sense, getting shorter because of the cultural forces at work, the objectification of children and the exposure of children to adult themes and imagery and knowledge. So that's one thought, that childhood is shortening, and that might present problems for our later development. Children don't have enough time to play, for example. But then the other question is, of course, are children really able to mature through making mistakes, through taking risks, and so on? So, which may be in such a security-centered culture as ours, where everything is being watched and surveyed, and this may limit the maturing of a child into adulthood. Anyway, what would you say would be in the light of those comments, what would you say would be the particular impact that contemporary social forces are having on shaping children's lives and their experience of being a child, or becoming a young person, becoming an adult? What are the particular forces today that they have to cope with?
more complexity, less stability, more uncertainty, less sense of predictability about their lives. So I guess, if we think about diverse family, I know I'm sort of thinking, I often mindful I'm speaking very much sometimes out of my own context, but I do a researching sort of other cultural contexts here and elsewhere. But whatever those family norms have been, so many of those have changed. We've got changing work patterns. We've got high levels of job insecurity. We've got, a generation of kids just about now that have lived under the threat of terror attacks. We've got young people now who are incredibly tuned into issues related to the environment and climate, and they are experiencing, we had it here in spades in Australia at the end of last year, natural disasters beyond belief, just in terms of massive bushfires, followed by floods. And of course we know that we've had a new kind of feature in their lives, which is called a pandemic, and that's kind of amplified some of that insecurity and that uncertainty that has really come to characterise many children's lives. I'm always reluctant, Laurence, to sort of, I certainly don't ever characterise children's lives in negative terms, but I think one of the things we fail to come to terms with over and over again is that children do need, and I think a lot of adults do too, but children do need to learn how to be able to live with uncertainty. When we talk, people sort of ask me the questions. I've done a lot of research around children who've experienced death and separation and divorce in their families, refugee, children who've left, suffered major change and loss in their lives, children who've lived through natural disasters and terror attacks and those sorts of things. But what I'd never want to do is characterise their experiences in negative terms, because what I meet in those interviews, what I analyse in those surveys is very often a real spark of their agency, of their capacity to be able to adapt or to learn about who they can lean on. So I think we've still got a long way to go, though, when we know that when we talk about, you and I were talking a little bit about trauma earlier on, and the fact that trauma follows children all their lives. How many adults have we met that have never had the opportunity to be able to make sense of the way that early trauma in their lives has kind of cast the direction in so many respects for them? But I do think that we can't, there's no evidence really to suggest that, for instance, divorce harms children. Divorce does not harm children. Ongoing unresolved conflict harms children like it harms adults. And divorce, for instance, in and of itself, does not necessarily address that. What children find the most difficult is the uncertainty in their lives that something like a divorce or a death or fleeing to another country or losing their house in a bushfire or whatever it might be. And I think we need to put a name on that, because I think all of the evidence is that uncertainty then results in that level of stress and anxiety that very often presents in those statistics that we're all gobsmacked about year after year, this year particularly with COVID, about the mental health problems that are arising from that. So it's a very long way of saying, while I think that their lives are characterised by more complexity and less stability, their lives are increasingly institutionalised. We send our kids to school at a younger, and preschools and, all those sort of things at a much younger age. We hear all the stuff about increasing individualism, that young people are more focused on the me, the competition, the I must win rather than the we. Well, it's not always my experience by a long shot. And we know that vast increase in the use of technology is really, shaping their understandings of themselves and their relationships and who they are in the world quite profoundly. So, I just keep kind of knocking gently at the door and saying we have to listen to this, because sometimes I think what we're focusing on is, what's not really the problem. The problem is very often, what does my life look like now, and who's out there, who's taking an interest in it, where's the opportunity for presence and for companionship in my life by an adult who can be present to me.
Thank you. That's a very fresh perspective and challenging our received wisdom, the generalized ideas we have. Thank you. What about COVID? This has been a sudden eruption, a sudden trauma that's touched the whole world. What effect is it having on young people and children and young people, do you feel?
Well, we've had a kind of a bit of a spate of research just lately that's been telling us, I think, three things that are particularly, we need to pay particular close attention to. I think one is the increased level of poverty and financial disadvantage for many of the world's children as a result of parents who are unable to work or who have lost their jobs. So again, thinking about the uncertainty that some of that raises is really important. In a lot of our work, particularly, there have been safety concerns. We have a lot of children who are not safe when there's at home when there's no COVID. So that was amplified quite significantly when they needed to be at home in lockdown. So there have been all sorts of impacts, I think, on many children in the community who we shouldn't forget, for whom home is not a refuge, and it's not a safe place, and it certainly wasn't a holiday, when they were not able to go to school. And of course the school closures, I think, have been a third sort of a big impact area where and it's going on, and we don't know for how long. I mean, I'm really aware where you are in France, other parts of Europe, and certainly in the UK. I've had an email tonight from somebody, a colleague in Northern Ireland, who's telling me that the second wave is now, in terms of our interests around children, a second wave is now going to hit them yet again in terms of what may need to happen. So the school closures, of course, has got a knock-on impact, because children rely on schools for more than learning. They rely on that for social connection, for engagement. Sometimes there's someone at school who really does know them and like them and care about them, and they may not have many experiences of that. We know that very often the kids that we expected not to do well with COVID and not being at school, actually some of those did do well, better than was systems expected, and then there are others that they thought would do phenomenally well, learning independently and online, and they didn't. So I think it sort of just underlines the fact that COVID's a ripple effect. I think with COVID, and we've not really known. We don't kind of know yet. The ones that I've found have COVID has impacted quite a bit on are those who are in their last year of school, because they kind of spent 13 years mentally preparing for an experience that many of them are not going to have. And so, again, that's raised issues for them. It's heightened concerns about what's out there in the big wide world. What do I need to know or do or be in order to be able to kind of adapt in a world that's not quite the one that I expected when I finished school.
Thank you. You're saying, and you were expanding on it just now, I think one of the great problems in the development of children and young people is the level and the kind of uncertainty and insecurity that they face. Some brain research, we're going to move to meditation now, some brain research seems to be very confident to say that the right hemisphere of the brain is much, it gives us the capacity to live with uncertainty, with unresolved questions, much more than the left hemisphere of the brain, which likes to get everything modeled and predicted and indexed. And of course, meditation has a very perceptible effect upon that right brain consciousness. And I think many people would say that meditation can reduce anxiety and produce better ways of resilience and coping with difficulties, maybe for that reason. So your research into meditation with children has been very thorough and very revealing. Could you say something, first of all, maybe about whether you think children have a natural capacity and a natural attraction to meditation? I'm not putting words into your mouth, but if you feel that. And also whether you feel at this time it's even more sensible to introduce them to meditation and to meditate with them in the classroom or online, as it may be.
Yeah, I think, I think all we've been talking about is certainly suggesting that children need tools that they can use that are going to help them to adapt to change, to live with failure sometimes, to take a risk, to reach out, to find a place in the world where they can contribute, all of those sorts of things. What do we know about Christian meditation? I mean, it sounds a bit kind of crude to put it this way, but as a tool, in the alongside all of the other tools. You know, it's a very busy space out there in schools, particularly for young people, with all of the programs and other things that they've got available, things that they learn about. What the science is right. The jury's not out. You're absolutely right, Laurence, in relation to meditation. While a lot of the brain research, you know, that's been done through MRI scans, the magnetic imaging, all of those things, looking at the ways in which contemplative practice changes the matter of the brain, you know, matter in the brain. It's quite an extraordinary thing. And we've only just started to say, if we've established that for adults, then can we run some of those similar clinical tests with children? And we've just had one in the last year or two that's showing the brain responds to the stillness and the discipline that's involved in contemplative practice in much the same way as it does for adults. What I think is really interesting is that what we're now finding is that meditating during childhood may be even more powerful in terms of brain connectivity. Some research is suggesting that the practice may be particularly beneficial during the brain, you know, kind of key brain restructuring period during their early adolescence. You know, we need to be able to take that seriously. If that's what the science is telling us, then we need to say, what can we learn then about the benefits of Christian meditation or contemplative practice more broadly for children? So back to your question, do children come to it naturally or eagerly, or any of those, in that sort of sense? Our experience, we did a study here in Australia that involved about 270 students, I think it was, and about 50 teachers. We tracked a cohort of students over 3 years in primary school, from year 4 to year 6. And what we found over that period of time is that some came to it relatively easily and some really struggled. What made the difference was the practice. So an opportunity where in the schools where we knew that it was happening, the children were meditating routinely, regularly, not for long periods of time, but day after day, would have been that we had much clearer indication there from students, both in the interviews that we did, in the surveys, that they said, I had to stay with it for a little while, but I got used to it, or I really struggled at first, or I get frustrated when I get distracted. They say all the same things we say about our own experience of Christian meditation. But I think what's really important about that, what I observed about that I thought was really interesting, and we know that the children couldn't have been worded up about this because the teachers didn't know the questions that we were going to ask them, was that they felt as a class that meditating together was a more inclusive experience than something like a lesson about meditating or kindness or God or anything else. So we thought that was really interesting. We've got really rich data on that. But in the same way, as I said earlier, you know, that's why we can't unhook, when we're doing research, we can't unhook what we're finding out from what we're assuming about children. If we go into what we're doing and say, much as science likes to be able to get cause and effect and to be able to generalise from what it is that we've found, when it comes to children's lives, it's not quite that easy. So I'd be worried if I didn't find that diversity. I think what's really important is actually working with the kids and saying, what helps when you get distracted? What helps when you don't feel like it today?
Very interesting and very practical too, because we're talking about what I think we all experience, the need for regular practice to develop the learning experience. And you know, John Main used to say, meditation is a learning experience. It isn't as if we master it and we've done and dusted that and now we can move on to mountain climbing or something. So, and children, like all of us, benefit from the structures for regular practice. So we have meditation groups online or physical. And of course, the children have a unique opportunity during those educational years because they live in quite a structured environment in school with classes and timetables and the same teachers helping them, we hope. So what would you say would be the what gets in the way of making meditation more accessible in the classroom today? I maybe you wouldn't put it quite like this, but it seems to me a no-brainer that meditation is good for children because they can do it, they like it, they speak beautifully about it, and certainly I haven't because I've done all the research you've done, but I was talking the other day to a man who I introduced to meditation 40 years ago, when he was, I think, 7 years old. And, you know, he's still meditating. He went through different periods where he gave up and so on, but it clearly was a seed that grew. So this is a gift that we can give to children, and certainly in many cases it may stay with them and germinate as a life-giving practice. So let's assume that it's not a bad thing to give meditation or lead children to meditation in the classroom. What's the block? Why isn't it happening? Or how could we make it easier?
Yeah, I mean, it's $1 million question, really. If we need, in my sense of things anyway, Laurence, is we need to go back and reflect really critically on what the purpose, for instance, of schools are, I think, to get to that question. If we are on about, let's say, in the context of schools generally, it might be Catholic or Christian-based schools or church-based schools particularly, but we want children to be able to learn well, we want them to be able to live well, and we want them to be able to love well. And we know from the science around Christian meditation, when we look at the benefits and we break them down, we've got increased cognitive functioning, sharper minds, in other words. We've got really extensively documented calming benefits. What goes with those two things very often, as we've talked about, is reduced anxiety, and we know that it drops this, the stress levels. So if it comes to things like learning well, for instance, if children are experiencing meditation and they are experiencing some of those benefits, we'll call them, of meditation, then to me it's sometimes a case of we're not joining the dots. This is not about an activity that's disconnected from everything else. What we're really saying is that if we take a shorthand for saying what do we want for kids, what do we want for them generally, but certainly in school context, to live well, learn well, and love well, what it will come down to is about priorities. So when we need to be thinking about what are the things that we want to do in schools that are going to promote that capacity for kids or create that space for children and young people, we're in a really crowded space. So we've got very crowded curriculum. We've got a lot of push down with that curriculum. We've got a lot of issues around reporting, around assessment, around teacher accountability, around teacher quality, around all sorts of things. The education environment in lots of ways is focusing on what we're doing, but we're not pulling up often enough to ask the question, why are we doing it? If we go to something like any intervention, you can take any intervention you like that's been shown to work, but let's just take Christian meditation for a moment. It just seems to me that if we answer that question, because it's often the one that we're asked, why would we do Christian meditation or contemplative practice of some kind with children in schools? Doesn't that belong somewhere else? Well, we would say if we look at what the evidence tells us is the benefits of that, that's going to benefit, the other things, that their capacity to be able to do so many of the other things that the busy place called school does. So the long answer, to your question, is really about it's almost kind of countercultural in schools to stop, to be silent, to be still, because everything is sort of around the doing. But if we go back to what I was mentioning earlier to Laurence, I keep coming back to this thing about children as human beings. We do need to create some space. The evidence says we need to create some space. Common sense, and a lot of teachers' intuitions will tell you we need to create some space. One of the writers on Christian meditation, I think borrowing on now and actually, talks about Christian meditation as a hospitable space, within an otherwise really busy and quite demanding environment that the children are in. So I think we need to keep on sharpening. We certainly need to keep looking at the evidence. Schools rightly want to know, why would we do it? Why? And we're able to answer that question. But I think we probably do need to keep working on the messaging around that, but we especially need to keep listening to what children and young people have to tell us about their experience, especially in relation to what changes for them as a result of that experience. And they can tell you what changes in terms of their relationship with themselves, their relationship with others, and their relationship with this thing that they call God. This other presence in their lives, and a felt sense of God, of being, they might describe it as feeling closer to God, or feeling like there's something really special happening just between me and God. What they're really talking about is the going in, I think, and that experience, that profound experience of God as love, that sense that they'll describe very often of feeling loved. And I think, wow, well, that's a gift, you know. And, you know, we can talk all we like about, you know, children's well-being if we don't also, you know, we know the benefits, I think, around mental health quite well now. We also just need to keep an eye on thinking about how does it help their meaning-making systems? How does it help them understand the purpose in their lives? If they don't have that, they'll get into trouble. How does it sort of give them a tool that, as you said about the person that you meditated with 40 years ago, how do we give them a tool that can be with them for life, something they've experienced deeply, but they'll be able to draw on again and again. And so many of the children that we've spoken to have said, I think this is something that I'll use later on. I think this is something I'll need later on. I've often thought it would have been great if we could have done a 10-year study and followed some of them on. I'm probably going on for too long, Laurence, but there's so much richness in the narratives of the children. We need to listen to the children's experience of Christian meditation, and we need to take seriously what they tell us about the value and the importance of that stillness, of that silence, and of that kind of interior being able to learn how to be comfortable with that, because it is so counter to the other lane that they're living in so often in their busy childhoods.
And thank you very much for your nuanced and very discerning, discriminating, very sharp insights and responses to these questions, and insights into what you have learned and what the children have taught you. I want to thank you for the contribution, you know, that work is making to our work in trying to make it easier for children to meditate. And a thought that comes to my mind listening to you reminds me of something you said at the beginning about the need for a theology of childhood. And just as I think, you know, we need more theologians who have an experience of marriage and raising children, rather than just celibate males or celibate females. So I think also maybe theology also needs some raw material, and perhaps the comments that children have made about their experience, and just what you were just saying about how they see it changing their lives and giving new dimensions to their life and capacities. That raw material of your research and the comments that children have made could well provide the matter for the beginning of a theology. I dropped that into your very fertile and productive mind.
Oh, we rarely ever have a conversation, Laurence, where you haven't dropped something. One of those led to a, I don't know, 3-4 year project, I think, where we tracked children just to see what they could tell us. So you never know. You know, I guess all of our lives is about sowing seeds, really, and you know, we don't know. We'll never, you know, we'll sort of never know, but certainly this work has been very close to my heart, because I have learned, I've been humbled, and I've been privileged to, you know, to be really taken into children's trust in lots of ways, and they've taught us much.
Thank you, Anne. You've taught us a lot. Thank you for giving us this time, late at night for you, I realized, after a long day in front of the screen. But you've been very fresh and very insightful, and I'm sure planted many seeds. And we do know, we can see some of those seeds growing, and your work has already begun to produce very real fruit and inspiration. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Laurence. Thank you.